The samurai, warriors, poets, I mean, they're almost mythical, aren't they? Their world is like flashing steel, total loyalty. And these stories, right? They've captivated us for centuries. And you've sent us this amazing collection of excerpts, diving into their history, their philosophy, even some of their legends. So are you ready to unpack like centuries of Japanese culture and conflict? Because trust me, the reality of the samurai, it's even more interesting than the legends.
Absolutely. And what's great about the excerpts you've got here, it goes way beyond the typical samurai tropes. We're talking about a warrior class that literally shaped Japan for over 700 years.
Okay, so these sources, they seem to start right at the beginning with the samurai's, like, origins. And actually, it turns out they weren't always the elite warriors we always picture. It's more like they started as, well, muscle, like local enforcers for regional lords.
Exactly. So in those early days, when Japan was transitioning to a feudal system, you had the emperor's power declining. And these local lords, these daimyo, needed someone to, keep things in line, enforce their will. And that's where the samurai came in.
And those early days sound, honestly, just as action-packed as any samurai movie. This Minamoto no Yoshitsune, for example. He's described in these sources as this brilliant, kind of tragic figure, exiled as a kid, caught in this power struggle, and then he leads this insane charge at the Battle of Ichinotani, charging down a cliff to surprise the enemy. Can you imagine?
Oh, Yoshitsune, he was a master tactician for sure. But his story, you're right, it's definitely a tragic one. His own brother turns against him, forces him into ritual suicide.
Yeah, it's a reminder that loyalty and honor, I mean, they're central to Bushido, to the whole samurai code, but it can be really complex and brutal.
Definitely a theme that runs through, all of samurai history. And speaking of brutal, those excerpts you have on the Mongol invasions, pretty stark contrast to the samurai's internal conflicts.
Oh, totally. So Kublai Khan, right, grandson of Genghis Khan, he sets his sights on Japan twice. That Mongol army, the sheer size of it must have been terrifying. It's like you have this clash of two totally different worlds. You've got the samurai, known for individual skill, they're honoring combat, and then the Mongols, this massive organized force, just brutal.
Yeah, totally different way of waging war. The Mongols, they brought unfamiliar tactic, their overwhelming numbers. It wasn't about individual skill anymore. It was about a nation's survival.
And that's where what do they call them? The kamikaze winds come in, right? It's 1281, this huge typhoon just decimates the Mongol fleet. What a turning point.
Yeah. It's tempting to just oversimplify it, right? As divine intervention. And don't get me wrong, that typhoon's impact was huge, undeniable. But the really interesting part, at least to me, is how this event, how it gets woven into the whole Japanese psyche.
You're saying it kind of reinforced this idea of Japan being divinely protected, this resilience against everything.
Exactly. And it's a narrative that you see over and over again throughout their history. But, surviving one enemy, it usually just makes way for new conflicts to pop up. And that's exactly what happens after the Mongols. Japan gets sucked into the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period.
So we go from these foreign invaders to, like, total internal conflict. The Sengoku Jidai, was it the Mongol victories that kind of paved the way for this whole Warring States thing?
It's not so much the victories themselves. I mean, the Mongols were ultimately pushed back. But it's more like the aftershocks of those invasions. They really shook things up. The existing power structures, they were weakened, and that gave ambitious daimyo the opportunity to try to grab power for themselves.
Okay, that makes sense. And throughout this time, you've got all these samurai clans constantly fighting to come out on top. It's a lot. But one name that really jumps out from these sources is Oda Nobunaga. He's described as, well, ruthless, ambitious, definitely, and totally into new technologies. Like, he sees muskets from Europe and he's like, I'll take 1,000.
Nobunaga, he just got it. He understood that warfare was changing. He wasn't tied to tradition. He'd use whatever gave him an advantage.
Right. And the Battle of Nagashino, 1575, that's the perfect example. His troops, they've got muskets, and they just wipe out the enemy cavalry.
It's kind of hard to imagine, right? You've got these horses charging in, and they're just met with a hail of bullets. Brutal, for sure. But it showed how gunpowder was changing the game. And not just in Japan either. This was happening everywhere.
It is pretty wild to see those parallels. Like, gunpowder was huge in Europe too, right? It just goes to show, even back then, Japan wasn't isolated. They were part of these bigger global shifts. So Nobunaga, he lays the groundwork for unifying Japan, but he doesn't get to actually see it happen.
That's right. It was actually his successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who achieved that unification. And his story. Talk about remarkable.
Totally.
Yeah.
This is a guy who went from basically being a farmer to, well, he was essentially the ruler of Japan.
It's true. And Hideyoshi's rise to power, it says a lot about the guy. Ambitious, for sure, cunning, and gotta say, a little bit of luck involved too. But it also shows that even in this seemingly rigid feudal society, there were ways to climb the ladder, if you were bold enough.
So he unifies Japan
Yeah.
and then decides to go after Korea.
Yeah, Hideyoshi.
Yeah.
His ambitions didn't end at Japan's borders. He wanted to create this huge empire, with Korea as a stepping stone. But if you look at these excerpts, that's kind of what did him in.
Because those Korean invasions were a total disaster.
They really were. Costly failure. Drained resources, created resentment. And looking back, it really contributed to a period of instability in Japan that lasted for decades. It set the stage for a new shogunate, the Tokugawa, and with them came a period of relative peace, but also a lot more isolation.
Which is interesting because we've been talking about how for a long time, Japan wasn't isolated. But then, boom, fast forward a couple of centuries, it's the 1800s, and everything's changing so fast.
Yeah, the world's going through some serious growing pains. In Japan, they're at a crossroads, trying to figure out how to deal with this rapidly changing world, how to modernize.
And this is where we get the Meiji Restoration, right? 1868, huge turning point for Japan, forces them to deal with these global changes. And from what I'm seeing in these sources, the samurai, even with their long history, they're kind of on the outs with this new era. Which leads us to Saigō Takamori. Talk about a complicated guy. He helps bring about the Meiji government, and then he turns against it, leads the Satsuma Rebellion.
Saigō's story. It really gets at this clash between tradition and modernization. Here you have this guy totally steeped in samurai ideals in Bushidō, and he's facing down a world that's moving on.
It's almost like Shakespearean, this warrior who helps usher in this whole new era and then realizes he can't deal with it, can't reconcile it with his beliefs, so he makes a stand even though he knows it's probably hopeless.
He did. In the Satsuma Rebellion, it's a testament to Saigō's conviction, but yeah, it was doomed from the start. You can't fight an army with rifles and cannons when you've got swords and, bravery.
And when Saigō died in that rebellion, that was really the end, wasn't it? The end of the samurai's traditional role in Japanese society.
It was.
Yeah.
I don't think it was just an ending. It was more like a transformation.
So the Satsuma Rebellion, kind of the end of an era for samurai as this warrior class. But you're right, their legacy, it didn't just disappear.
Not at all, because what did it even really mean to be a samurai? Beyond, the swords, the battles, these sources, they all point to Bushido. That was the real core of the samurai. It was their moral code, how they lived their lives.
Yeah, it wasn't just about being good at fighting. We talked earlier about how a lot of samurai, they were artists, poets, even strategists. So Bushido, it was about developing yourself as a whole person.
Exactly. The ideas behind Bushido, honor, courage, loyalty, those were seen as virtues for life, not just on a battlefield.
And yeah, a lot of samurai were skilled in calligraphy, poetry, the tea ceremony. It was about sharpening your mind just as much as your surf skills. And there's this one text that's mentioned in these sources that I thought was really interesting. The Hagakure. It talks about this, total acceptance of death.
The Hagakure, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a trip. And sure, it's controversial. But it does show a really important part of Bushido. To really live, to act without fear, you have to just accept that death is going to happen. This whole die well mentality, it's what fueled their courage, their sense of duty.
Intense. It really makes you think about how different their outlook on life was back then. But even now, we're still drawn to these samurai stories, movies, books. Their values, even if they seem kind of old-fashioned now, they still speak to us. Why do you think that is?
I don't think it's a coincidence. That samurai stories, they just grab us,
Yeah.
Yeah, there's the romantic side, the warrior thing, the swords. But I think it goes deeper. Bushido, when you get down to it, it's about mastering yourself, about serving something bigger than you. And those are things that never really go out of style.
Yeah. Even though their world was so different, those values, they still have something to teach us about how to be in the world.
Totally. We're probably not going to face the same things as a samurai on a battlefield. But the main ideas, discipline, integrity, striving to be your best, we can still learn from that stuff and use it in our own lives.
It's almost like we're all trying to find our own version of Bushido, our own set of rules for dealing with, everything life throws at us.
That's a good point. Maybe that's something for our listeners to think about. What would be the core values, the guiding principles of their own personal Bushido? What would it even mean to be a modern-day samurai? Something to chew on.
For sure. Well, there you have it. From those early days to becoming legends, the samurai, they've definitely left their mark on history. And their story, it's complicated, it's got all these layers, but it still fascinates us. Even after all these centuries, we just scratched the surface today, but hopefully this deep dive gave you a new way to see these warriors, their code, and the legacy they left behind.